Hey there, and welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into one of history's most misunderstood professions, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see our community spread across the globe, all united by a curiosity about the darker corners of history. If you enjoy these deep dives into the grittier side of ancient civilizations, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, but only if you genuinely find value in understanding how the other half lived, suffered, and survived in worlds we can barely imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's step back nearly 2,000 years to explore a life that Hollywood has romanticized beyond recognition, but the reality was far more brutal than any movie would dare to show. Picture this. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to the sounds of the bustling streets of ancient Rome filtering through the thin walls of your cramped room. The year is 150 AD, and you're about to experience 24 hours in the life of someone history barely bothered to record. Someone whose existence was simultaneously essential to Roman society and utterly despised by it. You might think you know this story. You've seen the movies, read the books, heard the tales of glamorous courtesans living lives of luxury in marble palaces. But strip away the Hollywood gloss, peel back the romantic fantasy, and what you'll find underneath is something far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more heartbreaking. This isn't the story of a high-class courtesan draped in silk and jewels. This isn't about those rare few who somehow managed to claw their way to wealth and influence. This is about the reality for the vast majority, the forgotten ones, the ones who worked the streets, the taverns, the cramped cells of the lupanaria, the ones whose daily existence was defined not by pleasure, but by survival. Today, we're going to walk in the sandals of a woman whose name history never bothered to preserve. We'll call her Livia, though that probably wasn't her real name. Names were luxuries that people like her couldn't always afford to keep. And through her eyes, we're going to discover just how brutal, degrading, and utterly soul-crushing life could be for those trapped in what the Romans euphemistically called the oldest profession. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. Everything I'm about to tell you isn't speculation or dramatic recreation. It's based on archaeological evidence, legal documents, graffiti scrawled on brothel walls, and the scattered writings of ancient historians who actually bothered to document the lives of society's most marginalized people. The Romans kept meticulous records. They taxed everything, regulated everything, cataloged everything, and yes, that included the women who sold their bodies to survive. What we've discovered from these records, from the ruins of Pompeii's red light district, from the legal codes that govern their lives, paints a picture so grim that it makes our modern understanding of exploitation look tame by comparison. See, here's what most people don't understand about prostitution in ancient Rome. It wasn't just legal, it was considered absolutely essential to the functioning of society. Roman men believed, quite literally, that the availability of prostitutes prevented the corruption of their wives and daughters. It was seen as a necessary evil that kept the social order intact. But that didn't mean the women involved were treated with anything resembling dignity or respect. The Romans had a dozen different words for prostitutes, each carrying its own particular shade of contempt. There were the meretrices, the registered ones who paid taxes and worked in licensed establishments. There were the prostibuli, the unregistered streetwalkers who operated in the shadows. There were the lupi, literally meaning she-wolves, who worked the cheapest, most dangerous areas of the city. And then there was our Livia, trapped somewhere in between all these categories, trying to navigate a world that needed her services, but despised her very existence, a world where the same men who visited her by night would cross the street to avoid her by day. Now, you might be wondering, how did women end up in this situation? Surely it was a choice, right? Well, that's where this story gets even darker. Because for the vast majority of women in ancient Rome's sex trade, choice had absolutely nothing to do with it. Some were slaves, bought and sold like any other commodity, with no more control over their bodies than a piece of furniture had over where it was placed. Others were abandoned children, left to die on the streets, and rescued by pimps who raised them for one specific purpose. Still others were women whose families had fallen into debt, and in a society where women had virtually no legal rights, selling a daughter's body was just another way to settle accounts. But even those who might have chosen this life, Even those who walked into it with their eyes open quickly discovered that the Roman sex industry was designed like a trap. Easy to enter, nearly impossible to escape. The legal system, the social structure, the economic reality, all of it worked together to ensure that once you were in, you stayed in. And that brings us to the most disturbing part of all, the sheer scale of this industry in ancient Rome. Conservative estimates suggest that in a city of roughly 1 million people, there were somewhere between 25 and 50,000 women working as prostitutes. That's roughly 1 in every 20 women in the entire city. The red light districts weren't small, hidden corners of shame. They were massive, sprawling neighborhoods that employed more people than most other industries combined. The Subura, Rome's most notorious district, was a maze of narrow streets lined with brothels, taverns, and apartments where the line between the two was deliberately blurred. Archaeologists have identified at least 35 major brothels in Pompeii alone, a city that had fewer than 20,000 residents. Do the math on that ratio, and you start to understand just how central this industry was to daily Roman life. But here's what makes this even more twisted. The same society that depended so heavily on these women also went to extraordinary lengths to mark them as social outcasts. Prostitutes were required by law to wear distinctive clothing, usually a toga instead of the stola worn by respectable women. They had to dye their hair specific colors, often blonde or red, to make them instantly recognizable. They were banned from certain parts of the city during daylight hours. They couldn't testify in court, couldn't inherit property, couldn't even be buried in the same cemeteries as other citizens. They existed in a kind of legal and social limbo, essential to the functioning of society but officially invisible within it. They were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, needed and despised, used and discarded. And that's where we find our Livia on this particular morning in 150 AD. Not in a palace, not draped in silk, but in a tiny room barely large enough for a bed, wondering how she's going to survive another day in a world that profits from her body while treating her like she doesn't even exist as a human being. The sun is barely peeking over the 7 hills of Rome, and already she can hear the sounds of the city coming to life outside her window. Merchants hawking their wares, slaves hurrying to market, the endless rumble of cartwheels on stone. In a few hours, her world will come alive too. The taverns will fill with customers, the brothel doors will open, and she'll once again become a commodity in Rome's vast economy of flesh and desperation. But for now, in these quiet moments before dawn, she's still just a woman. Tired, probably hungry, definitely afraid, because in ancient Rome, being a prostitute meant living with the constant knowledge that today might be the day a customer decided you weren't worth keeping alive. It meant knowing that the law offered you no protection, that society saw you as disposable, that your life had value only as long as your body could generate profit for others. This is her story. Not the romanticized version you've seen in movies, but the real thing, the daily grind of survival in a world that was designed to consume her and throw her away. The endless cycle of degradation, punctuated by brief moments of human connection, that made it all bearable, even if just barely. And as we follow her through this single day, from the moment she wakes up to the moment she falls asleep, we're going to discover that the reality of ancient Rome's sex trade was far more complex, far more brutal, and far more human than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show us. We're going to see how the economic system worked, how the social hierarchy functioned, how the legal framework operated. We're going to understand why this industry was so central to Roman life, and why the women trapped within it were treated with such systematic cruelty. But most importantly, we're going to remember that behind every statistic, every legal code, every archaeological artifact, there was a human being. Someone's daughter, maybe someone's mother, definitely someone who deserved better than the world gave her. So settle in, because this isn't going to be comfortable, this isn't going to be pretty, but it is going to be honest. And in a world where we still struggle with exploitation, trafficking, and the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable people, maybe understanding how it worked in ancient Rome can help us recognize it when we see it today. The morning light is getting stronger now, filtering through the cracks in Livia's shutters. In the distance, she can hear the first customers of the day already stirring in the tavern below. Her day is about to begin, and with it, our journey into one of history's darkest corners. This is what it really meant to sell your body in ancient Rome. This is why it sucked in ways that most people can't even imagine. And this is just the beginning of a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about sex, power, and survival in the ancient world. Livia's eyes snap open, not from rest, but from habit. In her world, deep sleep is a luxury she can't afford. Too many women have been robbed, beaten, or worse while lost in dreams. She's learned to sleep like a cat, one ear always tuned to the sounds beyond her door. The room she calls home is roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. That's smaller than most modern closets. The walls are thin plaster over brick, stained with years of smoke, sweat, and things she tries not to think about. There's no window, just a small opening near the ceiling that barely lets in enough light to tell day from night. The air is thick, stale, carrying the perpetual smell of oil lamps, unwashed bodies, and the vinegar the brothel keeper uses to mask other odors. Her bed is a simple wooden frame with a straw mattress that's been used by countless women before her. The straw is old, compacted, and probably home to more insects than she'd care to count. A rough woolen blanket provides her only warmth, and even that belongs to the brothel, not to her. In the corner sits a small clay pot for washing, though the water is changed maybe once a week, and a smaller pot for her other needs. But here's what hits you first about Livia's morning routine. It's not what she does, it's what she doesn't do. She doesn't stretch luxuriously in bed. She doesn't contemplate her plans for the day. She doesn't even really wake up in the way we understand it, because part of her never truly sleeps. Instead, she immediately begins the mental calculation that governs every moment of her existence. How many customers from yesterday? How much did the brothel keeper take? How much does she owe for food, for rent, for the protection that never seems to actually protect her from anything? See, here's what most people don't understand about the economics of prostitution in ancient Rome. The women almost never kept the money. They were trapped in a web of debt that was designed to be impossible to escape. The brothel keeper charged them for everything: the room, the food, the oil for the lamps, the water for washing, even the vinegar-soaked sponges they used to try to prevent pregnancy and disease. Livia owes money for yesterday's meals, which consisted of bread, watered-down wine, and maybe some cheese if she was lucky. She owes money for the cosmetics she's required to wear, the cheap rouge and lead-based face paint that's slowly poisoning her but makes her look more appealing to customers. She owes money for the lamp oil that burned in her room, for the laundry, for the medical attention when customers got too rough. And here's the really twisted part. She also owes money for protection, not from the authorities. They don't care what happens to her. Not from violent customers. They're considered the cost of doing business. No, she owes money for protection from the very people who own the brothel. It's a protection racket dressed up as employment, and it ensures that no matter how many customers she serves, no matter how much money she brings in, she never quite manages to pay off her debts. As Livia sits up on the edge of her bed, her body immediately reminds her of yesterday's work. Everything hurts, her back aches from the thin mattress and the position she's forced into. Her legs are sore from standing in the doorway for hours trying to attract customers. Her face feels tight from the cosmetics, and her skin is dry and irritated from the harsh soaps used to clean up between clients. But it's not just the physical pain, it's the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from being constantly vigilant, constantly performing, constantly afraid. Roman customers didn't just want sex, they wanted entertainment, conversation, sometimes even emotional connection. Livia had to be whatever each customer needed her to be. Seductive for the shy ones, submissive for the aggressive ones, experienced for the young ones, innocent for the old ones. She was required to be a shapeshifter, adapting her entire personality dozens of times a day. The first sound she hears every morning is the same. The brothel keeper, a freedman named Marcus who bought his way out of slavery by selling other people's bodies, banging on doors and shouting for the women to get ready. His voice is rough, gravelly from years of shouting over the noise of taverns and brothels. He calls them his girls, but the way he says it makes it clear they're livestock to him, not human beings. Up, whores, the day's customers won't wait for your beauty sleep. It's not quite dawn, but in the Roman sex trade, business started early and ended late. Different customers came at different times. The working men before they headed to their jobs, the wealthy citizens during their afternoon leisure time, the soldiers after they'd been paid, the married men sneaking out after their wives had gone to sleep. Livia reaches for the small bronze mirror that's one of her few personal possessions. It's cracked down the middle, a souvenir from a customer who got angry when she couldn't perform a particular service he'd requested. Looking at her reflection, split down the center by that crack, sometimes feels like looking at her life. Divided, broken, but still functional enough to serve its purpose. Her reflection shows the toll that 18 months in the brothel have taken. She's maybe 20 years old, though she's not entirely sure. Keeping track of birthdays wasn't a priority when you were sold into slavery as a child. Her hair, which she's required to keep dyed bright red to mark her profession, is dry and brittle from the harsh dyes. Her skin, once olive and smooth, now has a grayish pallor that no amount of rouge can completely hide. But it's her eyes that tell the real story. They're older than her face, older than her body. They've seen things that would break most people, and they've learned to look through customers rather than at them. It's a survival mechanism, this ability to disconnect her mind from what's happening to her body. The Romans had a word for it, dissociatio, the art of being present but not present, there but not there. The morning routine begins with what the brothel euphemistically calls preparation. Livia pours a small amount of water from her clay pot into a bowl and begins washing. The water is cold, of course. Hot water is for paying customers, not for the women who service them. She uses a rough piece of cloth and a bar of soap that's more lye than anything else, harsh enough to clean, but gentle enough not to damage the merchandise. But this isn't just about cleanliness, it's about transformation. Every morning, Livia has to transform herself from a tired, frightened young woman into a commodity. She has to become whatever the customers expect a prostitute to be. And in ancient Rome, those expectations were very specific. First, the makeup, lead-based face paint to lighten her skin because pale skin was considered more attractive. Rouge made from red ochre for her cheeks and lips to make her look healthy and vibrant even when she's anything but. Kohl around her eyes to make them appear larger and more seductive. The makeup isn't subtle or natural, it's theatrical, designed to be visible even in the dim light of oil lamps. Obvious enough that everyone who sees her knows exactly what she is. Next, the clothing. Prostitutes in Rome were required by law to wear togas instead of the stola worn by respectable women. But these weren't the white togas of citizens. Prostitutes wore togas in bright colors, yellow or red or orange, colors that announced their profession from a distance. The fabric was cheap, rough wool that chafed against the skin, and the toga itself was designed to be easily removed. Modesty wasn't just discouraged, it was literally illegal for women in her profession. The jewelry comes next. Cheap bronze bangles, glass beads, anything that catches the light and draws attention. It's not beautiful jewelry, it's advertising. Every piece serves the same purpose, to make her visible, to make her available, to make her obviously and undeniably what she is. But the most important part of her morning preparation isn't what she puts on. It's what she takes off. She has to remove any trace of her real self, any hint of the person she might have been in a different life. She has to become Livia the prostitute, not Livia the woman. She has to bury her fears, her hopes, her personality so deep that customers will never catch a glimpse of them. Because here's what the customers were really buying. They weren't just buying sex, though that was certainly part of it. They were buying the fantasy that she enjoyed it, that she wanted them, that this was her choice rather than her trap. They were buying the illusion that she was a willing participant in her own exploitation. And maintaining that illusion was the hardest part of her job. By the time she's finished with her morning transformation, Livia barely recognizes herself in the cracked mirror. The frightened young woman is gone, replaced by a painted smile and dead eyes that have learned to look inviting even when they feel nothing. She's ready for another day of being whatever her customers need her to be, of pretending that selling her body is something she does by choice rather than something that's being done to her. The sun is fully up now, and she can hear the brothel coming to life around her. Other women moving in their rooms, the sound of customers already arriving for early morning appointments, Marcus shouting orders and counting yesterday's profits. In a few minutes, she'll have to open her door and step into the hallway, where she'll spend the next 14 hours competing with other desperate women for customers who see them all as interchangeable. But for these last few moments of privacy, she allows herself one small ritual that she's never told anyone about. She closes her eyes and tries to remember her real name, the one she had before she was sold, before she became property, before she became Livia. Some days she can remember it clearly, other days it feels like trying to grasp water. Today is one of the bad days. The name hovers just out of reach, like a dream that fades the moment you try to hold on to it. This is the reality that no movie has ever shown you. This is what it meant to be a prostitute in ancient Rome. Not glamour, not luxury, not choice, just survival, one day at a time, in a world that needed your body but despised your humanity. And this is just the beginning of Livia's day. The hardest parts are still to come. The door to her room opens with a creak that seems to echo through her bones. It's the same sound every morning, but it never gets easier. That creak means her private world is ending and her public performance is about to begin. Marcus is already in the hallway, his heavy footsteps moving from door to door, collecting his girls like a farmer gathering livestock for market. Move, move. The early birds are already here and they've got coins burning holes in their purses. Livia steps into the narrow corridor that connects the small rooms of the brothel. The hallway is barely wide enough for two people to pass, and the ceiling is so low that tall customers have to duck. The walls are covered in graffiti, scratched into the plaster by bored customers waiting their turn. Most of it is crude, graphic descriptions of what they want to do or what they've already done. Some of it is just names and dates, like a grotesque guest book of human misery. But scattered among the vulgar scrawls are messages that tell a different story. Livia is beautiful, carved carefully into the wall near her door. Claudia, I love you, written in a shaky hand. Remember me, etched so deep it must have taken hours. These aren't just customers marking territory. These are glimpses of something more complicated, more human. Men who found something in these transactions beyond mere physical release. And that's part of what made this life so psychologically devastating. It wasn't that every customer was a monster. Some were lonely, some were kind in their way, some genuinely seemed to care about the women they visited. But even the kindest customer was still participating in a system that treated human beings as commodities. Even the gentlest interaction was still a transaction where her consent had been purchased rather than freely given. The other women are emerging from their rooms now, and Livia can read the night stories in their faces. Claudia has a fresh bruise on her cheek that her makeup can't quite hide. Tertia is limping slightly, trying not to let Marcus notice because showing weakness means fewer customers, and fewer customers means even more debt. Julia looks like she hasn't slept at all, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. But they all go through the same morning ritual. They paint their faces, arrange their hair, adjust their clothing, and transform themselves into products ready for sale. It's a sisterhood born of shared suffering, but it's also a competition. In a world where your survival depends on attracting customers away from the woman in the next room, friendship becomes complicated. Line up, ladies. Let's see what we're working with today. Marcus walks down the line like a general inspecting troops, or more accurately, like a trader examining merchandise. He adjusts their makeup, critiques their appearance, assigns them to different areas of the brothel based on what he thinks the day's customers will want. You, Claudia, upstairs today. Your face is a mess, but the upper rooms are darker. Customers won't notice as much. He turns to Livia. You're in the tavern. Try to smile like you mean it. Yesterday, you looked like someone died. The tavern, that means a different kind of day entirely. The tavern attached to the brothel served food and wine, but everyone knew what the real business was. It was where customers came to drink, to socialize, to look over the available women before making their choices. It was part marketplace, part theater, part hunting ground. Working the tavern meant being on display for hours at a time. It meant sitting at tables with customers, laughing at their jokes, listening to their stories, pretending to be fascinated by their lives while they decided whether or not to purchase yours. It meant navigating the complex social dynamics of groups of men who were drinking, showing off to each other, and competing to see who could afford the most attractive woman. But it also meant tips. Small coins tossed onto the table for bringing wine, for laughing at a joke, for allowing a customer to touch her arm or her hair. These tiny amounts weren't much individually, but they were the only money that didn't automatically go to Marcus. Hidden in her clothing, saved in tiny caches throughout the brothel, these coins represented the closest thing to hope that her world allowed. The tavern is already busy when she arrives. The morning crowd consists mostly of working men grabbing a quick drink and a quicker transaction before heading to their jobs. Merchants, laborers, off-duty soldiers, freedmen with a few coins to spend. They're not the brothel's most profitable customers, but they're reliable. And in a business built on volume, reliability matters. Livia takes her position near the bar where she can be seen by anyone entering the room. The morning light streaming through the tavern's windows is harsh, showing every flaw that the brothel's dim corridors had hidden. But that's intentional. The contrast between the bright, public tavern and the dark, private rooms adds to the sense of transgression that many customers were seeking. The first customer of the day approaches before she's even fully settled in her spot. He's a baker, his hands still dusted with flour, his tunic stained with the honest work of feeding the city. He's probably in his 40s, with the soft belly that comes from sampling his own products, and the tired eyes of a man who gets up before dawn every day. "Wine," he says to the tavern keeper, then nods toward Livia. And conversation. This is how it begins. Not with crude propositions or immediate negotiations, but with the pretense of normalcy. The baker sits beside her, orders his wine, and starts talking about his business, his customers, the rising price of grain. For all appearances, they could be friends meeting for a morning drink. But Livia knows the script. She nods at the right moments, asks the right questions, laughs at his attempts at humor. She lets him rest his hand on her arm when he makes a point, doesn't pull away when he moves closer under the pretense of being heard over the tavern's noise. This is part of the service, the illusion that she's interested in him as a person rather than as a source of income. "You know," he says after a second cup of wine, "I have a room upstairs. We could continue this conversation somewhere more private." And there it is, the moment when the pretense drops away and the real business begins. Livia nods, smiles, and quotes him a price. It's not her price, of course. It's Marcus's price, minus the small percentage she'll be allowed to keep if she's lucky. The baker nods, drops coins on the table, and they head toward the stairs. The rooms upstairs are slightly larger than the ones where the women sleep, but not by much. They're furnished with a bed, a small table, a wash basin, and little else. The walls are thin enough that you can hear everything happening in the adjacent rooms, which is sometimes part of the appeal for customers who enjoy the knowledge that others can hear their conquest. What happens next isn't love, isn't passion, isn't even really desire in any meaningful sense. It's a transaction, mechanical and efficient. The baker gets what he paid for, Livia provides what was purchased, and they both go through the motions of pretending it's something more than commerce. But here's what makes it truly degrading. It's not just the act itself, it's the performance required around it. She has to act like she enjoys it, like she's attracted to him, like this is something she wants rather than something she endures. She has to stroke his ego along with everything else, make him feel powerful and desirable and chosen. 15 minutes later, it's over. The baker leaves his coins on the small table, along with a small tip that he probably thinks makes him generous rather than simply less exploitative than he could have been. He heads back to his bakery, back to his normal life, back to the world where he's a respectable citizen contributing to society. Livia washes, reapplies her makeup, and heads back downstairs to wait for the next customer. It's not even mid-morning yet, and the day is just beginning. By nightfall, she'll repeat this scene a dozen times or more, each time with a different man but the same script, the same performance, the same mechanical intimacy that has nothing to do with human connection and everything to do with economic necessity. The tavern is busier now. The morning rush is in full swing, and customers are evaluating their options while they drink. Some are regulars who know exactly what they want. Others are first-timers, nervous and trying to act casual while they work up the courage to approach one of the women. She watches them watching her, these men who need what she's selling but despise themselves for needing it. They look at her like she's simultaneously the solution to their problems and the cause of them. They want her to be available but not too eager, experienced but not too jaded, seductive but not threatening. And through it all, she maintains the smile, the performance, the illusion that this is her choice rather than her trap. Because that's what they're really paying for. Not just her body, but her complicity in their fantasy that what's happening here is somehow mutual, somehow acceptable, somehow different from what it really is. The morning wears on, customer by customer, transaction by transaction. Each one chips away a little more of whatever humanity she has left. Each one adds a few more coins to Marcus's purse, and maybe, if she's careful and lucky, a tiny amount to her own hidden savings. This is the reality of being a prostitute in ancient Rome. Not the glamorous courtesan of popular imagination, but the grinding, soul-crushing daily routine of selling yourself piece by piece to men who see you as a commodity rather than a person. And this is still just the beginning of her day. The afternoon and evening will bring different customers, different challenges, different degradations. But for now, she sits in the tavern, painted smile in place, waiting for the next man who will pay for the privilege of using her body while pretending he's doing her a favor. And she counts the hours until nightfall, when she can finally retreat to her tiny room and try to remember who she was before she became this. The sun climbs higher in the Roman sky, and Livia's day continues its relentless march toward evening. In a few hours, the character of the clientele will change completely, bringing new challenges and new dangers. But that's a story for the next part of our journey into the darkest corners of ancient Rome. By noon, the tavern's atmosphere has shifted entirely. The working men have gone to their jobs, replaced by a different class of customer altogether. These are the men of leisure, the wealthy citizens who don't need to work for a living, who spend their afternoons moving from bathhouse to tavern to brothel in an endless cycle of self-indulgence. They dress better, smell better, carry themselves with the casual arrogance that comes from never having to worry about where your next meal is coming from. But in many ways, they're worse than the morning customers. The working men at least had the decency to be quick about their business. These afternoon patrons see the brothel as entertainment, a place to spend hours drinking, gambling, and treating the women like living furniture. Marcus appears at Livia's elbow, his breath reeking of the wine he's been sampling all morning. "Senator's son just walked in," he whispers. "Gaius Flavius, rich boy with daddy issues and a fat purse. Make sure he has a good time, if you catch my meaning." She catches his meaning perfectly. When wealthy customers visit, the entire brothel transforms. Suddenly there's better wine, cleaner rooms, even a musician who plays soft melodies in the corner. The women are expected to be more cultured, more conversational, able to discuss poetry and politics, along with providing their other services. Gaius Flavius is everything Marcus described and worse. He's maybe 25, with the soft features and pale skin that come from a life spent entirely indoors. His toga is purple-striped, marking him as nobility, and his fingers are heavy with rings that probably cost more than most people earn in a year. He moves through the tavern like he owns it, and in a very real sense, he does. His class owns everything, including the women who work here. "You," he says, pointing at Livia without bothering to learn her name, "bring wine. The good stuff, not the swill you serve the plebs." She brings the wine, imported from Greece and worth more per cup than she sees in a week. He doesn't thank her, doesn't acknowledge her as a person. She's a servant, a tool to be used as needed. But she's learned to read the signs, and she can tell this is going to be a long afternoon. Gaius has brought friends, other young men from wealthy families who are slumming in the brothel for entertainment. They treat the place like their private club, ordering the women around, making crude jokes, seeing who can be the most outrageously offensive without consequences, because there are no consequences. Not for them. "I heard," says one of them, a thin youth with cruel eyes, "that prostitutes in Egypt paint their nipples gold. Is that true?" He's looking at Livia when he asks, expecting her to answer, to engage with their conversation, as if this is normal social interaction. She forces a laugh. plays along with their game because refusing would mean losing the tip, and losing the tip might mean not eating tonight. I wouldn't know, Master, she replies. I've never been to Egypt. Master, Gaius laughs. I like that. You hear that, boys? She knows her place. This goes on for hours. They order food, wine, entertainment, treating the brothel like their personal playground. They make the women dance for them, sing for them, compete for their attention like performing animals. And through it all, Livia maintains her smile, plays her part, pretends that this humiliation is somehow enjoyable. But it's during these afternoon sessions that she sees the true depths of Roman cruelty. These aren't desperate men seeking physical release. These are bored aristocrats amusing themselves with the suffering of people they consider barely human. They tip well, but only to demonstrate their power, to show that they can afford to be generous with creatures so far beneath them. Tell me, Gaius says, leaning close enough that she can smell the wine on his breath, do you enjoy this work? Do you wake up every morning excited to spread your legs for strangers? It's a trap, of course. If she says yes, she's admitting to being the kind of depraved creature their society believes all prostitutes to be. If she says no, she's spoiling their fantasy that this is all voluntary, that she's here by choice rather than by circumstance. I enjoy pleasing you, Master, she says carefully. It's the safest answer, the one that feeds their ego without admitting to anything that could be used against her later. Good answer, he laughs. You're smarter than you look. Finally, after what feels like an eternity, Gaius decides he wants privacy. He selects not just Livia, but 2 other women, because apparently one isn't enough to satisfy whatever twisted desires he's harboring. They head upstairs to one of the larger rooms, the ones reserved for wealthy customers who can afford to rent them for extended periods. What happens in that room over the next 2 hours is something Livia will spend years trying to forget. It's not just the physical acts, though those are degrading enough. It's the psychological cruelty, the deliberate humiliation, the way Gaius and his friends treat the 3 women like props in their own private theater of domination. They make them perform not just sexual acts, but elaborate scenarios designed to reinforce every stereotype about prostitutes. They're forced to beg, to compete with each other for attention, to enact scenes of such degradation that even experienced brothel workers find them disturbing. And through it all, they have to smile, have to act grateful, have to pretend that being treated like animals is somehow a privilege because their abusers are wealthy. Because in Rome, wealth doesn't just buy you comfort and luxury. It buys you the right to treat other human beings however you want, secure in the knowledge that there will never be consequences. When it's finally over, Gaius tosses a handful of coins on the bed like he's feeding scraps to dogs. The amount is substantial by brothel standards, enough to keep Marcus happy and maybe leave a little for the women themselves. But money can't wash away the taste of humiliation, can't undo the psychological damage of being treated like a living toy. The 3 women clean themselves, reapply their makeup, and head back downstairs. The tavern is busier now, filled with the afternoon crowd of merchants, traders, and citizens finishing their business for the day. To them, nothing has changed. The women are back in position, smiling and available, ready for the next customer. But something has changed, something invisible but real. Each encounter like this chips away a little more of their humanity, makes it a little harder to remember that they're people rather than products. It's a slow erosion of the soul, as deliberate and systematic as the erosion of a cliff by ocean waves. The afternoon customers are different from both the morning workers and the wealthy leisure class. These are the businessmen, the shopkeepers, the skilled craftsmen who form the backbone of Roman commerce. They have more money than the morning crowd, but less time than the afternoon aristocrats. They want efficiency, value for money, a quick transaction that won't interfere with their busy schedules. Marcus moves through the tavern like a general commanding troops, directing customers to women, negotiating prices, making sure the money keeps flowing. He's developed the brothel's operations into a science, understanding exactly what each type of customer wants, and how to provide it as efficiently as possible. "Livia," he calls out, "Table 3 wants company. Spice merchant just back from Syria. He's got exotic tastes and exotic coins. Make sure he leaves happy." The spice merchant is a weathered man in his 50s, his hands stained with turmeric and his clothes carrying the scent of distant lands. He's been on the road for months, trading Roman goods for the precious spices that flavor the food of the wealthy. He's lonely, homesick, and carrying more money than is probably safe in this part of the city. "Tell me about Syria," Livia says as she settles beside him. It's not just small talk. She's learned that many customers want conversation as much as physical intimacy, especially the traveling merchants who spend months away from home. "I've heard the markets there are like nothing in Rome." His eyes light up, and for the next hour he regales her with stories of Damascus markets, of caravans crossing the desert, of the incredible variety of spices and goods available in the East. She listens, asks questions, laughs at his stories, and for a brief moment almost forgets that this is all performance, all part of the service she's being paid to provide. But then the conversation turns, as it always does. The merchant's hand finds her knee, his voice drops to a whisper, and the familiar negotiation begins. Price is discussed, services are specified, and they head toward the stairs like actors following a script they've performed countless times before. The room they enter is one of the middle-tier ones, cleaner than the basic cells, but not as luxurious as the suites reserved for nobility. The merchant is gentle, almost apologetic about what they're here to do. He talks throughout the encounter as if words can somehow transform a commercial transaction into human connection. "I have a daughter about your age," he says afterward, and immediately looks stricken by his own words. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that." But he has said it, and now they both have to live with the implications. Livia forces a smile, tells him it's fine, that she understands loneliness, that this is what she's here for. Inside, she's wondering if his daughter knows what her father does when he's away from home, if she'd still respect him if she knew he pays for intimacy with girls her own age. These moments of accidental humanity are sometimes the hardest part of the job, when customers reveal their vulnerability, their loneliness, their essential human need for connection. It becomes impossible to maintain the emotional distance that makes survival possible. It's easier when they're cruel or dismissive, when she can hate them cleanly. It's harder when they're simply sad, broken people looking for comfort in the only way they know how. The merchant leaves a generous tip, not because he's trying to show off his wealth, but because he seems genuinely grateful for the conversation, for the illusion of companionship. He touches her hand as he leaves, a gesture that might be tender in other circumstances, but feels hollow here. Evening approaches, and the tavern's clientele shifts again. The businessmen head home to their families, replaced by a rougher crowd. Soldiers, sailors, laborers who finished their shifts and received their pay. These men are tired, often drunk, sometimes violent. They have less money than the afternoon customers, but more urgent needs, and they're less interested in conversation than in quick, efficient satisfaction. The atmosphere in the brothel changes too. The lighting becomes dimmer, the music louder, the wine stronger. It's as if the entire establishment is preparing for the more dangerous part of the day, when desperation and alcohol combine to create situations that can turn ugly quickly. Livia positions herself near the back of the tavern, where she's visible but not prominently displayed. Evening customers can be unpredictable, and she's learned to read the signs that distinguish merely rough trade from genuinely dangerous men. The key is in their eyes, their posture, the way they move through the room. Desperation has a particular smell, and violence has a particular energy that experienced prostitutes learn to recognize. A group of soldiers enters, their bronze armor clanking, their voices already raised from pre-drinking at another establishment. They're celebrating something, probably a successful military campaign or a bonus payment, and they're looking to spend their winnings on wine and women. Marcus immediately appears at their table, his most obsequious smile in place, ready to separate them from their money as efficiently as possible. "Welcome, heroes of Rome," he calls out. "What can we offer to celebrate your glorious service to the Empire?" The soldiers are young, maybe 18 or 20, with the swagger that comes from surviving their first real military action. They've seen battle, killed men, and now they want to celebrate life in the most primal way possible. They order wine, lots of it, and begin surveying the available women like generals planning a campaign. One of them, a tall youth with a fresh scar across his cheek, points directly at Livia. "You, come here." It's not a request, it's a command, delivered with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She approaches their table, knowing that soldiers can be among the most dangerous customers. They're trained to use violence, accustomed to taking what they want, and often see prostitutes as legitimate spoils of war. "What's your name, girl?" the scarred soldier asks. "Livia, if it pleases you." "Livia," he repeats, tasting the name. "Pretty name for a pretty whore. Tell me, Livia, have you ever been with a real man, a soldier who's killed enemies of Rome with his own hands?" She knows the script for this type of customer. They want to feel powerful, dangerous, irresistible. They want her to be impressed by their martial prowess, intimidated by their capacity for violence, grateful for their attention. "Never, master," she lies smoothly. "I can only imagine how exciting that must be." The soldier grins, pleased by her response. "Well, tonight's your lucky night. Boys, I think we've found our entertainment." What follows is a negotiation that's really more like an auction. The soldiers bid against each other for her time, driving the price higher and higher while she stands there like a prize being fought over. Eventually, the scarred soldier wins, paying enough for several hours of her exclusive attention. They head upstairs to one of the larger rooms, and Livia prepares herself for what's likely to be a long, difficult night. Soldiers often have specific ideas about what they want, influenced by their experiences in military brothels and their need to assert dominance after months of following orders. They can be rough, demanding, and sometimes violent, especially when they've been drinking. But as they enter the room, something unexpected happens. The soldier's bravado seems to evaporate, replaced by something almost vulnerable. He sits heavily on the bed, suddenly looking much younger than his 20 years. "I killed a man last week," he says quietly. "First time. They told us it would feel different, that we'd feel proud, heroic, but I just feel empty." And there it is again, that moment of accidental humanity that makes everything more complicated. This isn't just a customer looking for physical release. This is a traumatized young man trying to process experiences that his society has given him no tools to understand. He's seeking comfort, connection, some kind of affirmation that he's still human after doing inhuman things. Livia finds herself in the familiar position of being part prostitute, part therapist, part mother figure to a man who's simultaneously her customer and her potential threat. She has to provide not just physical services, but emotional labor, helping him work through his trauma while maintaining the fiction that she's enjoying every minute of it. The encounter that follows is less about sex than about human connection, about a young soldier's desperate need to feel something other than the emptiness that war has left inside him. It's still a transaction, still exploitation, but it's also something more complex, something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories that society has created for these interactions. When it's over, the soldier leaves not just money, but a small gift, a carved bone pendant that he says brought him luck in battle. It's a gesture that would be touching in other circumstances, but here it feels almost tragic. He's trying to create meaning, to transform a commercial transaction into something resembling human connection, not understanding that the very nature of their relationship makes such connection impossible. The night continues, customer by customer, each bringing their own needs, their own damage, their own particular way of using her body to try to fill whatever emptiness drives them to this place. Some are quick and efficient, others want to talk. Still others need to exercise their power in ways that leave her feeling more like an object than a person. By the time the brothel finally closes, near midnight, Livia has serviced 8 different customers. Her body aches, her face hurts from maintaining fake smiles, and her soul feels scraped raw from the constant performance of enthusiasm for her own exploitation. She's earned enough money to keep Marcus happy and maybe, if she's careful, save a tiny amount for herself. But the real cost isn't measured in coins. It's measured in the slow erosion of her sense of self, in the growing difficulty of remembering who she was before she became this, in the increasing challenge of believing that she's a human being deserving of dignity and respect. As she climbs the stairs to her tiny room, Livia can hear the sounds of the city settling into sleep around her. Families going to bed together, lovers holding each other, children being tucked in by parents who love them. All the normal human connections that her world has made impossible. She reaches her door, steps inside, and begins the process of transforming back from commodity to person. She washes off the makeup, removes the gaudy jewelry, takes off the clothes that mark her profession. But she can't wash away the day's experiences, can't remove the psychological residue of being treated like an object for 14 straight hours. Tomorrow will bring another day exactly like this one. More customers, more performances, more small deaths of the spirit. The only difference will be in the details, the particular faces and voices and demands that she'll have to accommodate while pretending it's all her choice. This is the reality that no romantic story about ancient courtesans will ever capture. This is what it really meant to sell your body in ancient Rome. Not glamour, not luxury, not even the dignity of honest work. Just survival, one degrading transaction at a time. In a world that needed what you offered but despised you for offering it. And as Livia finally lies down on her thin mattress, listening to the sounds of other women in other rooms dealing with their own private hells, she allows herself one moment of truth. She closes her eyes and tries to remember what it felt like to be touched with tenderness instead of purchased passion, to be valued for something other than her body, to be seen as a person instead of a service. But those memories are fading, worn away by the relentless grind of daily exploitation. Soon, she fears there will be nothing left but the performance, nothing real beneath the painted smile and practiced movements. Soon she might forget entirely that she was ever anything more than what she's become. The oil lamp flickers and dies, plunging her room into darkness. In a few hours, the sun will rise again, Marcus will start shouting, and another day exactly like this one will begin. Because in ancient Rome, being a prostitute didn't just mean selling your body, it meant selling your humanity piece by piece, day after day, until there was nothing left but the hollow shell of whatever you used to be. And that's why it sucked in ways that most people, even today, can barely comprehend. The darkness in Livia's room feels heavier tonight, pressing down on her like the weight of all those bodies that have used her today. But sleep, that merciful escape, refuses to come. Her mind won't stop calculating, won't stop replaying, won't stop preparing for tomorrow's fresh horrors. Because here's what happens when you spend your days being treated like merchandise. Your brain starts working like a ledger. How many more customers until she can afford real food instead of the scraps Marcus provides? How many more months until her debt might actually decrease instead of growing? How many more years until her body gives out completely and she's thrown into the streets to starve? The math is always the same, depressing, hopeless, designed to keep her exactly where she is. She shifts on the straw mattress, and every movement sends sharp reminders of the day's work shooting through her body. The soldier had been rougher than he'd seemed at first. The spice merchant's gentleness had somehow hurt worse than outright cruelty. And Gaius Flavius and his friends had left marks that would take days to fade, assuming they fade at all. But it's not just the physical pain keeping her awake, it's the knowledge of what tomorrow will bring. Because in the Roman sex trade, every day follows the same soul-crushing pattern. But each one also brings new degradations, new customers with new perversions, new ways to chip away at whatever humanity she has left. The sounds from the other rooms have mostly stopped now. Claudia's customer left hours ago, but Livia can still hear her sobbing through the thin walls. Tertia is coughing again, that wet, rattling cough that means the lung sickness is getting worse. Julia's room is silent, which could mean she's finally sleeping, or it could mean something much worse. In the brothel world, silence is often more terrifying than noise. Livia pulls the rough blanket tighter around her shoulders and allows her mind to wander to the question that haunts every woman in her position. How did she end up here? Not the immediate circumstances of her slavery, those are clear enough, but the deeper question. How does a society create a system so perfectly designed to trap and exploit the vulnerable? The answer, she's learned, lies in the very foundation of Roman civilization itself. Rome wasn't built on the ideals of freedom and dignity that they loved to proclaim. It was built on conquest, exploitation, and the systematic dehumanization of anyone who couldn't fight back. Slaves, foreigners, women, the poor, they were all just resources to be consumed by the machine of empire. And prostitutes, they weren't even considered worthy of the basic protections afforded to other slaves. A household slave had value as property. She could be sold, traded, but rarely killed outright because that would be destroying valuable goods. But women in the sex trade were disposable, replaceable. There were always more desperate girls being sold into slavery, always more families driven to such poverty that selling a daughter seemed like the only option. The system was brilliant in its cruelty. It created a steady supply of victims while simultaneously making those victims complicit in their own exploitation. Because every woman working in the brothels understood that her survival depended on making her customers happy, on maintaining the fiction that this was somehow mutual, somehow acceptable. Fight back, resist, refuse a customer, that was a luxury that only existed in the fantasies of people who'd never actually lived this life. Resistance meant beatings, starvation, or worse. It meant being thrown out onto the streets where the choices were even more limited and the dangers even more immediate. A sound in the hallway makes her freeze. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving slowly down the corridor. It's too late for regular customers, and Marcus doesn't usually make his rounds until just before dawn. This could be a drunk looking for trouble, or a customer who's decided he wants more than he paid for, or worse. The footsteps stop outside her door. Livia holds her breath, listening. In the brothel, unexpected visitors in the night usually meant violence. Customers who felt cheated, who wanted to take out their rage on the women they blame for their own moral failings. Soldiers who decided they deserved free services as a reward for their military service. Nobles who thought their status gave them the right to anything they wanted, regardless of payment. 3 soft knocks. That's not the pattern of someone looking for trouble. It's almost polite. Livia? A woman's voice, barely above a whisper. It's Claudia. Are you awake? She opens the door to find Claudia standing in the hallway, her face streaked with tears, her arms wrapped around herself like she's trying to hold her body together by force of will. The bruise on her cheek has darkened to a deep purple, and there's blood on her lips. Can I stay here tonight? I can't be alone right now. It's a dangerous request. Marcus doesn't allow the women to fraternize in each other's rooms. He claims it's about maintaining discipline, But really, it's about preventing them from forming the kinds of bonds that might lead to collective resistance. Isolated women are easier to control than women who support each other. But looking at Claudia's face, at the desperate need in her eyes, Livia steps aside and lets her in. Some things matter more than Marcus's rules. They sit together on the narrow bed, two women who've been reduced to commodities trying to remember what human connection feels like. Claudia's story spills out in whispered fragments. The customer who'd paid for her exclusive attention for the evening, the things he'd demanded, the way he'd laughed when she'd tried to resist, the casual violence that had followed. "He told me I should be grateful," Claudia whispers. "He said most whores would pay him for the privilege of servicing a citizen of his standing." This is the psychological warfare that makes the Roman sex trade so devastating. It's not enough to exploit these women physically. The system is designed to make them believe they deserve it, that they should be thankful for the abuse, that their degradation is somehow their fault. "I keep thinking about my sister," Claudia continues. "She's married now, has children, lives in a nice house with a garden. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if our father had sold her instead of me. It's a thought that haunts many of the women here. The randomness of it all, the way that accidents of birth, timing, and circumstance determine who gets to live a normal life and who gets fed to the machine of exploitation. Claudia's sister hadn't been more virtuous or more deserving of happiness. She'd just been luckier. They talk through the night, sharing stories they've never told anyone else, about their lives before the brothel, about the families they've lost contact with, about the dreams they used to have before those dreams became impossible. It's dangerous, this kind of intimacy. It makes the pain of their daily existence sharper, more real, but it also reminds them that they're still human, still capable of empathy, of connection, of caring about someone other than themselves. The system wants them to believe they're nothing but bodies for rent, but here in the darkness, they prove that something essential remains unbroken. As dawn approaches, they can hear Marcus beginning his morning routine, shouting at the other women to prepare for another day. Claudia slips back to her own room, and Livia begins the familiar process of transformation from person to product. But something has changed. The night of connection with Claudia has reminded her that she's not alone, that there are others who understand her pain, who share her struggle. It's a small thing, but in a world designed to strip away all sources of hope, small things can be revolutionary. The morning customers arrive with their familiar demands and their casual cruelty. The afternoon brings the usual parade of wealthy men treating the brothel like their personal playground. The evening delivers its quota of soldiers and workers looking to spend their pay on temporary escape from their own problems. But throughout it all, Livia carries with her the memory of that conversation, that moment of human connection that reminded her she's more than just a collection of services to be purchased. It doesn't make the work easier, doesn't reduce the pain or the degradation, but it provides something that the system is designed to destroy, a sense of shared humanity. And that's perhaps the most insidious aspect of the Roman sex trade. It wasn't just about exploiting women's bodies for profit. It was about destroying their spirits, breaking down their sense of self-worth, making them complicit in their own dehumanization. Because a woman who believes she deserves better might find ways to resist. A woman who's been convinced she's worthless will endure almost anything. The days blur together into a continuous cycle of exploitation and degradation. Wake up, transform into a product, service customers, endure whatever they demand, collect whatever coins Marcus allows her to keep, collapse into exhausted sleep, and wake up to do it all again. But occasionally there are moments that break through the routine. A customer who treats her with unexpected kindness, a conversation with another woman that reminds her she's not alone, a memory from her life before that surfaces unbidden and reminds her that she used to be someone else. These moments don't change her circumstances, but they keep alive something essential that the system is trying to kill. They preserve some small part of her that remains untouchable, even in the midst of daily violation. One afternoon, while working the tavern, she overhears a conversation between two merchants that stops her cold. They're discussing a new law being proposed in the Senate, one that would require all prostitutes to register with the authorities and submit to regular inspections by government officials. It's about public health, one merchant explains to the other. Can't have diseased whores spreading illness to respectable citizens. The irony is crushing. The same society that creates the conditions forcing women into prostitution now wants to regulate and inspect them like livestock to protect the very men who exploit them. It's not about their health or safety, it's about making sure the commodity remains profitable for everyone except the women themselves. But the conversation also reveals something else. The authorities are worried enough about disease, about unrest, about the growing visibility of the sex trade to consider new regulations. And worry, Livia has learned, can sometimes create opportunities. Not for escape, that's still impossible, but for small acts of resistance, tiny moments of reclaiming some measure of agency in a system designed to strip it away completely. Information can be power, even for powerless people. Knowledge of what the authorities are planning, what customers are thinking, what other women are experiencing. As the weeks turn into months, Livia begins to notice things she'd been too overwhelmed to see before. The way certain customers behave differently when they think no one is watching. The patterns in Marcus's business dealings that might be exploited. The small networks of support and resistance that exist even within the oppressive structure of the brothel. She's not planning a dramatic escape or a heroic rebellion. Those kinds of fantasies belong to people who don't understand how thoroughly the system is designed to prevent them. But she's learning to find tiny spaces of agency within her imprisonment. Small ways to retain some measure of dignity even in the midst of degradation. It's a different kind of survival than the purely physical endurance that got her through her first months in the brothel. This is psychological survival, the preservation of some essential part of herself that can't be bought or sold or rented by the hour. The work continues, as brutal and dehumanizing as ever. The customers keep coming with their demands and their casual cruelty. The coins keep flowing into Marcus's purse while she receives barely enough to survive. The days and nights blur together in an endless cycle of exploitation. But something has shifted, something invisible but real. She's beginning to understand that even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when reduced to the status of property, human beings find ways to preserve their essential humanity. Not through grand gestures or dramatic acts of defiance, but through small moments of connection, tiny acts of resistance, and the stubborn refusal to let the system completely destroy what makes them human. It's not enough to change her circumstances, but it's enough to keep her alive in ways that matter beyond mere physical survival. And in a world designed to strip away everything that makes life worth living, sometimes that has to be enough. The Roman sun sets on another day in the life of a woman whose name history will never remember, whose story will never be told in the grand narratives of empire and conquest. But her struggle, her pain, and her stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the system that exploits her represent something important about human resilience in the face of systematic oppression. Tomorrow will bring another day exactly like this one, with its familiar cycle of degradation and endurance. But it will also bring new opportunities for those tiny acts of resistance, those small moments of human connection that keep alive something the system can never quite manage to destroy completely. Because even in ancient Rome, even in the brothels where human beings were reduced to commodities, the essential spark of humanity found ways to survive. Battered, diminished, barely recognizable, but still somehow present, still somehow defiant, still somehow human. And that perhaps is the most important part of Livia's story. Not the exploitation and degradation, though those are certainly real, but the way that even under the most oppressive circumstances, even when treated as nothing more than property, human beings find ways to remain human. It's a lesson that resonates across the centuries, a reminder that no system of oppression, no matter how thoroughly designed, can completely destroy the essential dignity of human existence. It can be buried, hidden, nearly extinguished, but something always survives, something always resists, something always remembers what it means to be human, even when the world seems determined to make you forget. As the oil lamp flickers back to life in Livia's cramped room, casting dancing shadows on the cracked plaster walls, we need to understand something that most people never consider about life in ancient Rome's sex trade. It wasn't just about the women. The entire system was a carefully orchestrated machine that involved dozens of other people, each playing their part in keeping the exploitation flowing smoothly. Think about Marcus, the brothel keeper. He wasn't some cartoonish villain twirling his mustache while counting coins. He was a businessman operating within a legal framework that the Roman state had carefully constructed. He paid taxes on his establishment, submitted reports to local magistrates, and followed regulations that were designed not to protect the women, but to maximize revenue for the empire. Every morning, before Livia and the other women even woke up, Marcus was already at work, counting the previous day's earnings, calculating taxes owed, planning which women would work which shifts based on customer demand. He kept detailed records not because he cared about the women's welfare, but because the Roman bureaucracy demanded documentation of every transaction. The state took its cut from every coin that changed hands in the brothel. Prostitutes were taxed as independent contractors, even though they had no control over their working conditions, their prices, or their clientele. It was a brilliant system of double exploitation. The women generated revenue through their bodies, and then that revenue was taxed to fund the very government that kept them trapped in the system. But Marcus wasn't operating alone. He had connections throughout the city's underworld and legitimate business community. Suppliers who provided food, wine, and oil for the lamps. Doctors who would treat injuries and diseases, though their services were expensive and often ineffective. Money lenders who provided credit when business was slow, at interest rates that made debt almost impossible to repay. There were also the enforcers, men who weren't officially employed by the brothel, but who made sure that customers paid their bills and that the women didn't try to escape. These weren't brutal thugs, though they could be violent when necessary. They were more like a private police force, maintaining order in a business that existed outside the normal protections of Roman law. The customers themselves were part of the system too, though most of them probably never thought about it that way. They weren't just purchasing sexual services. They were participating in a complex economic network that touched every level of Roman society. Take that spice merchant who had been so gentle with Livia, who had seemed almost apologetic about the transaction. He wasn't just a lonely traveler seeking comfort, he was a link in a trade network that stretched from the markets of Damascus to the brothels of Rome. The coins he spent on Livia's services would flow through Marcus's hands, get taxed by Roman officials, and eventually help fund the very military campaigns that protected his trade routes. The wealthy customers like Gaius Flavius weren't just indulging their personal appetites. They were demonstrating their social status, their power, their right to consume whatever they could afford. In Roman society, the ability to purchase human beings for sexual gratification was a mark of success. a symbol of having achieved the kind of wealth and position that put you above normal moral considerations. Even the working-class customers, the bakers and laborers who visited the brothel before their shifts, were playing their part in the system. Their coins might be fewer, but they were steady, reliable income that kept the brothel profitable during slower periods. And their participation helped normalize the entire enterprise, made it seem like a natural part of urban life rather than systematic exploitation. But perhaps the most crucial participants in this system were the ones who never set foot in the brothel at all. The senators who wrote the laws that regulated prostitution, the tax collectors who ensured the state got its share of the profits, the judges who settled disputes between brothel owners and refused to hear complaints from the women themselves. The wives and daughters of Roman citizens played a role too, though they would have been horrified to think about it that way. The entire justification for the sex trade was that it protected respectable women from the uncontrolled lust of Roman men. Prostitutes existed, according to this logic, so that wives could remain pure and daughters could remain virginal until marriage. This created a strange dynamic where respectable women were simultaneously protected by the prostitution system and threatened by it. They benefited from having male sexual appetites directed elsewhere, but they also lived under the constant reminder that their own value was tied to their sexual purity. One mistake, one moment of indiscretion, and they could find themselves on the other side of the divide. The religious establishment was deeply involved too. Roman priests didn't condemn prostitution the way later Christian clergy would. Instead, they incorporated it into their understanding of divine order. Certain temples actually employed sacred prostitutes, women who served the gods through sexual rituals that were considered holy rather than degrading. This religious sanction gave the entire sex trade a kind of spiritual legitimacy that made it even harder to question. If the gods themselves approved of prostitution, who were mortals to object? The system wasn't just economically profitable and socially convenient, it was divinely ordained. Even the architecture of Rome was designed to accommodate and conceal the sex trade. Brothels were built in specific neighborhoods, away from the main thoroughfares where respectable citizens conducted their daily business. But they were connected to those areas by a network of narrow alleys and side streets that allowed customers to come and go without being seen. The famous Roman baths played a role too. Many of them had attached facilities where sexual services were available, creating a seamless transition from social gathering to commercial transaction. A Roman citizen could spend his afternoon socializing with friends, discussing business and politics, and then quietly slip away to purchase sexual services without anyone commenting on the transition. The slave markets were another crucial component of the system. This is where many of the women working in brothels had originally been purchased, though not necessarily for that purpose. A girl might be bought as a household servant and then sold to a brothel owner when she reached puberty. Or she might be purchased specifically for sexual services, examined and evaluated like livestock before being assigned a price. These markets operated with the same legal framework as any other commercial enterprise. Buyers could return merchandise that didn't meet their expectations. Sellers provided warranties about the health and sexual experience of the women they were offering. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly regulated, perfectly integrated into the normal functioning of Roman commerce. The training system was particularly insidious. Young girls who were destined for the sex trade weren't just thrown into brothels and expected to figure things out. They were taught, usually by older women who had survived long enough to become instructors, how to please customers, how to manage their own health, how to maximize their earnings within the constraints of their situation. This training wasn't just about sexual techniques, it covered conversation skills, basic literacy for those who would serve wealthy customers, even elements of theater and dance. The goal was to create a product that would be appealing to the widest possible range of customers, and that meant developing a complex set of performance skills. The medical system that served prostitutes was a shadow version of the healthcare available to other Romans. There were doctors who specialized in treating the diseases and injuries common in the sex trade, but their services were expensive and often ineffective. Pregnancy was treated as a business problem rather than a health issue, with various methods used to prevent conception or terminate pregnancies that would interfere with work. Birth control in ancient Rome was primitive and dangerous. Women used a variety of substances and devices, most of which were more likely to cause infection than prevent pregnancy. When these methods failed, abortion was common, though it was risky and often fatal. The brothel owners preferred women who could work continuously without the interruption of pregnancy and childbirth. The legal system provided another layer of control over women in the sex trade. Prostitutes had virtually no rights under Roman law. They couldn't testify in court cases involving their customers, couldn't inherit property, couldn't even legally marry in most circumstances. This legal invisibility made them vulnerable to every form of exploitation and abuse. But the system also created its own internal hierarchy and social structure. Not all prostitutes were equal. There were subtle but important distinctions based on where you worked, what kind of customers you served, and how much money you could generate for your owners. At the bottom were the women who worked the streets, servicing the poorest customers in doorways and alleys. They had no protection, no fixed location, no guaranteed income. They were completely vulnerable to violence, weather, and the whims of local authorities who might decide to clear them out of a particular area. Next came the brothel workers like Livia, who had some minimal protection and a regular place to work. They served a wider range of customers and had slightly more predictable income, though they were still trapped in debt and completely subject to their owner's control. Above them were women who worked in more upscale establishments, serving wealthy customers in better surroundings. These women might have some limited freedoms, better food and clothing, and the possibility of earning enough to eventually buy their freedom, though this was rare. At the top of the hierarchy were the courtesans, women who served only the wealthiest and most powerful customers. These were the ones who inspired the romantic myths about ancient prostitution, but they represented a tiny fraction of women in the trade. Most would never even see that level of comfort and autonomy, let alone achieve it. This hierarchy served an important function in maintaining the system. It gave women at lower levels something to aspire to, a reason to compete with each other rather than cooperate against their exploiters. It also provided customers with choices, allowing them to purchase different levels of service based on their economic status. The entertainment industry was closely connected to prostitution in ways that made the boundaries between the two almost meaningless. Actresses, dancers, and musicians were often expected to provide sexual services along with their artistic performances. The theater was considered a disreputable profession, partly because of these expectations. This connection between entertainment and prostitution created another pipeline feeding women into the sex trade. A girl who showed talent for singing or dancing might be purchased specifically for that ability, only to discover that her artistic skills were considered secondary to her sexual availability. The Roman military played a huge role in sustaining the sex trade. Soldiers were customers, obviously, but they were also enforcers of the system. They kept order in the brothel districts, protected the establishments from robbery and violence, and sometimes provided security for higher-end operations. Military campaigns created their own temporary sex markets as armies moved across the empire. Women would follow the legions, setting up temporary brothels near military camps. Some were independent operators, but many were enslaved women who were transported like any other military supply. The expansion of the Roman Empire created a constant supply of new women for the sex trade. Every military victory meant new slaves, and young women were always in high demand for sexual services. The system was literally fueled by conquest and war. Trade networks also played a role in moving women around the empire. Merchants didn't just transport goods, they transported people, including women destined for brothels in distant cities. A girl captured in Gaul might end up working in a brothel in Egypt, completely cut off from any possibility of returning home. This geographic dispersal was another form of control. Women who might have tried to escape if they were close to their families had no such options when they were thousands of miles from home, unable to speak the local language, and completely dependent on their captors for survival. The economic cycles of the empire affected the sex trade just like any other business. During prosperous times, when trade was good and military campaigns were successful, customers had more money to spend and business was brisk. During recessions or after military defeats, the brothel struggled along with everyone else. But the women working in the brothels had no protection during these economic downturns. When business was slow, they still owed the same amounts for food and shelter, but they earned less money to pay these debts. This created a downward spiral that made escape even more impossible. The seasonal rhythms of Roman life affected the trade too. Summer brought more customers as travel became easier and trade increased. Winter was slower, with fewer travelers and less economic activity. Women had to save money during good periods to survive the lean times, but the debt system made saving almost impossible. Religious festivals and public celebrations created spikes in business as men celebrated with wine and sexual indulgence. The same religious system that provided moral justification for prostitution also created economic opportunities for the brothel owners. Even the Roman calendar was designed in ways that supported the sex trade. The numerous festivals and holidays gave men leisure time and reasons to celebrate, which often meant visiting brothels. The religious and social structure of Roman life created a rhythm that kept the brothels profitable throughout the year. The information networks that connected different parts of the empire also connected different parts of the sex trade. Brothel owners shared information about profitable practices, difficult customers, and women who had tried to escape. A woman who ran away from a brothel in Rome might find herself blacklisted from similar establishments throughout the empire. This information sharing created a kind of informal guild system among brothel owners, though it was never officially organized. They cooperated when it served their interests and competed when it didn't, but they all benefited from maintaining the overall system that kept women trapped and profitable. The urban planning of Roman cities was designed to accommodate the sex trade while keeping it somewhat hidden from public view. Brothels were located in specific neighborhoods, connected by narrow streets that allowed customers to come and go discreetly. The famous red light districts weren't accidents of development, they were carefully planned commercial zones. The infrastructure of these districts was designed for the sex trade. Buildings were constructed with multiple small rooms, each just large enough for a bed and a wash basin. The walls were thin enough that sounds carried between rooms, which was sometimes part of the entertainment for customers who enjoyed the knowledge that others could hear their activities. Water supply and waste disposal in these areas were managed differently than in other parts of the city. The volume of customers and the nature of the activities required more frequent cleaning and waste removal, but this was seen as a cost of doing business rather than a public health concern. The lighting in red light districts was deliberately dim, using oil lamps and torches rather than the brighter lighting found in commercial and residential areas. This served multiple purposes. It saved money, it made the women look more attractive by hiding flaws, and it provided customers with a sense of anonymity. Even the food and drink served in brothels were part of the commercial strategy. Wine was watered down to increase profits, but also to keep customers drinking longer without becoming completely intoxicated. Food was simple and cheap, designed to keep customers in the establishment without cutting too deeply into the profits from sexual services. The entire Roman economy was structured in ways that made the sex trade not just profitable, but essential. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite created a large class of men who could afford to purchase sexual services regularly. The poverty of the masses created a steady supply of women who had no other economic options. Currency and banking systems facilitated the trade by making it easy to move money and calculate profits across the empire. The same financial innovations that supported legitimate commerce also supported the exploitation of human beings for sexual profit. Even the Roman legal system was designed to support the sex trade while maintaining the illusion of moral order. Prostitution was legal and regulated, but prostitutes themselves had no legal rights. Customers were protected by law, but the women who served them were not. This legal framework created a kind of parallel justice system where different rules applied to different classes of people. A citizen who killed a prostitute might face a fine for destroying property, but he wouldn't be charged with murder. A prostitute who stole from a customer, on the other hand, could face severe punishment, including death. The tax system treated prostitution as a legitimate business while simultaneously marking everyone involved as morally inferior. Brothel owners paid taxes like any other merchants, but they were barred from holding public office or participating in certain religious ceremonies. The women themselves were taxed on their earnings, but they couldn't vote or own property. This system of legal discrimination served multiple purposes. It generated revenue for the state, it maintained social hierarchies, and it ensured that people involved in the sex trade remained politically powerless and unable to organize for better conditions. The Roman postal system, which connected the far reaches of the empire, also connected different parts of the sex trade. Information about profitable locations, successful business practices, and available women moved along the same routes that carried official government communications and legitimate commercial correspondence. This communication network allowed the sex trade to operate as an empire-wide system, rather than just a collection of local businesses. A brothel owner in Rome might receive information about business opportunities in distant provinces, or a trader might arrange to transport women to locations where demand was high. The same roads that carried Roman legions and commercial goods also carried enslaved women destined for brothels throughout the empire. The infrastructure that made Roman civilization possible also made systematic sexual exploitation possible on an unprecedented scale. Transportation technology determined how the sex trade operated. Women could be moved relatively quickly and safely along Roman roads, but they could also be easily tracked and recaptured if they tried to escape. The same systems that made commerce efficient also made human trafficking efficient. The storage and preservation technologies that allowed Romans to maintain food supplies over long distances also allowed them to maintain supplies of enslaved women. Temporary housing, basic medical care, and minimal nutrition could keep women alive and functional during transport from one location to another. All of these systems, all of these technologies, all of these legal and economic structures worked together to create something that was much more than just individual brothels serving local customers. They created an empire-wide network of sexual exploitation that touched every level of Roman society. And at the center of it all, in her tiny room with its cracked walls and straw mattress, was Livia. Not just a victim of individual cruelty, but a small cog in a vast machine designed to extract profit from human suffering. A machine so complex and so thoroughly integrated into Roman civilization that most people never even thought about how it worked. They just knew that when they wanted sexual services, those services were available. When they wanted to feel powerful, there were powerless people available for them to dominate. When they wanted to indulge their appetites without consequences, there was an entire system designed to make that possible. Tomorrow, Livia will wake up and participate in this system once again. Not because she chooses to, but because every alternative has been systematically eliminated. And thousands of other women throughout the empire will do the same, each one trapped in her own tiny room but connected to all the others by the invisible networks of exploitation that held the Roman world together. This is what it really meant to be a prostitute in ancient Rome, not just the individual degradation and suffering, though those were certainly real, but also the knowledge that you were part of something larger, something that reached into every corner of the civilized world, something that was considered not just acceptable but essential to the functioning of society itself. And that knowledge, that understanding of just how thoroughly the system was designed to trap and exploit her, might have been the cruelest part of all. As we reach the end of Livia's story, it's important to understand that her experience wasn't unique. Across the Roman Empire, in cities from Londinium to Alexandria, thousands of women lived variations of this same nightmare. The system was so perfectly designed, so thoroughly integrated into Roman society, that it seemed as natural and inevitable as the rising and setting of the sun. But here's what makes this historical reality so chilling when we examine it today. Every single aspect of the Roman sex trade has modern parallels. The debt bondage that trapped women like Livia still exists. The legal frameworks that criminalize victims while protecting exploiters still exist. The social attitudes that blame women for their own exploitation still exist. The Romans didn't invent sexual exploitation, but they perfected it. They created a system so efficient, so profitable, and so socially accepted that it became a model that has influenced human trafficking and sexual exploitation for 2,000 years. When we look at modern sex trafficking operations, we're not seeing something new. We're seeing the Roman system updated with modern technology and transportation. Think about the psychological manipulation that kept Livia trapped, the constant debt that could never be repaid, the isolation from family and support networks, the legal invisibility that meant her complaints would never be heard, the social stigma that made escape impossible even if she could physically leave the brothel. These aren't ancient tactics. They're the same methods used by traffickers today. The normalization of the system was perhaps its most insidious aspect. Romans didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as participants in a natural economic system that served everyone's interests. The customers believed they were preventing social disorder by directing their appetites toward appropriate outlets. The brothel owners believed they were providing essential services while operating legitimate businesses. Even the government officials who regulated and taxed the trade believed they were maintaining public order and generating necessary revenue. This normalization made resistance almost impossible. When an entire society agrees that something is normal and necessary, individuals trapped within that system have no language to describe their oppression, no framework for understanding that alternatives might exist. Livia couldn't imagine a world without prostitution any more than she could imagine a world without slavery or taxation. It was simply part of the natural order. The customer base tells us something crucial about Roman masculinity and power structures. These weren't just desperate men seeking physical release. They were citizens, soldiers, merchants, and nobles who saw the purchase of sexual services as a normal expression of their social status. The ability to buy another human being for sexual gratification was considered a privilege of citizenship, a reward for economic success, a demonstration of masculine power. This created a culture where sexual exploitation wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Men boasted about their conquests in brothels the same way they boasted about their victories in business or politics. The degradation of women like Livia wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the system. It was the entire point. The economic scale of the Roman sex trade was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest it employed more people than most other industries in major cities. The amount of money flowing through brothels, taverns, and private establishments was enormous, generating tax revenue that funded everything from military campaigns to public works projects. The entire Roman economy was partially built on the systematic sexual exploitation of vulnerable women. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the complete absence of any significant opposition to the system. There were no abolitionists in ancient Rome, no reformers calling for the end of sexual slavery, no religious leaders condemning the commodification of human sexuality. The system was so thoroughly accepted that questioning it was literally unthinkable. This tells us something important about how oppressive systems maintain themselves. They don't rely primarily on violence or force, though those are certainly present. They rely on consensus, on the shared belief that things must be this way because they've always been this way. They create entire worldviews where exploitation seems natural, necessary, even beneficial for everyone involved. The women themselves were trained to participate in this consensus. Part of Livia's daily performance involved convincing customers that she enjoyed her work, that she was grateful for their patronage, that this was her choice rather than her trap. This wasn't just about individual transactions. It was about maintaining the psychological framework that allowed the entire system to function. When we examine the archaeological evidence from places like Pompeii, we see how thoroughly the sex trade was integrated into daily Roman life. Brothels weren't hidden in dark corners of the city. They were prominent businesses on major streets, advertising their services with explicit artwork and graffiti. The red light districts were commercial centers that employed thousands of people and generated enormous wealth. The preserved graffiti in these locations gives us glimpses into the minds of the customers. Some of it is crude bragging about sexual conquests, but much of it reveals more complex emotions. Loneliness, affection, even love for specific women. This emotional complexity made the system even more psychologically devastating for the women involved. Imagine being Livia and reading messages from customers who claimed to love you, knowing that their love was really just ownership, that their tender feelings didn't translate into any concern for your welfare or freedom. The emotional manipulation was as damaging as the physical exploitation, perhaps more so. The medical evidence from ancient Rome shows the devastating physical toll of prostitution. Skeletal remains of women from brothel districts show signs of malnutrition, repeated injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, and premature death. The average lifespan of a prostitute in ancient Rome was probably less than 30 years, but the system didn't rely on keeping individual women alive for long periods. It relied on a constant supply of new victims to replace those who died, aged out, or became too damaged to be profitable. This disposability was built into the economic model. Women weren't investments to be maintained over time. They were consumable resources to be used up and replaced. The legal framework that governed prostitution reveals the Roman attitude toward human dignity and individual rights. Prostitutes existed in a legal gray area where they were simultaneously regulated like businesses and ignored like property. They paid taxes but had no legal protections. They were subject to government oversight but had no recourse when that oversight failed them. This legal invisibility made systematic abuse inevitable. When someone has no legal rights, no ability to seek justice, no protection from violence or theft, they become completely vulnerable to every form of exploitation. The Romans didn't accidentally create this vulnerability. They deliberately constructed it because it served their economic and social interests. The religious justifications for prostitution show how spiritual systems can be corrupted to serve oppressive ends. Roman priests didn't just tolerate the sex trade, they sanctified it. Temple prostitution was considered a holy service, a way of honoring the gods through sexual ritual. This religious approval made moral opposition almost impossible. When the gods themselves are said to approve of sexual exploitation, questioning the system becomes not just socially difficult, but spiritually dangerous. The Romans used religion as another tool of control, another way of making the unthinkable seem not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. The social hierarchy within the sex trade created divisions among the women that prevented collective resistance. By creating different levels of prostitution with different privileges and working conditions, the system ensured that women would compete with each other, rather than cooperate against their oppressors. A street prostitute might dream of working in a brothel. A brothel worker might aspire to serve wealthy customers in better surroundings. A courtesan might look down on women working in taverns. These artificial distinctions prevented the formation of solidarity that might have led to organized resistance. The geographic scope of the Roman sex trade meant that escape was virtually impossible even for women who managed to leave individual establishments. A woman who fled a brothel in Rome would find similar establishments throughout the empire, all connected by informal networks that shared information about runaways. There was literally nowhere to go where the system didn't reach. This created a kind of psychological prison that was even more effective than physical restraints. When you know that escape is impossible, when you understand that the entire world operates according to the same rules that trap you, resistance becomes not just dangerous, but pointless. The intergenerational aspect of the sex trade ensured its continuity across centuries. Daughters of prostitutes often ended up in the same profession, either because they were sold by desperate mothers or because they had no other economic options. The system literally reproduced itself through the exploitation of children. This creates a particularly horrifying dimension to the story. Livia wasn't just suffering herself, she was potentially creating the next generation of victims. If she had children, those children would likely face the same fate she had endured. The system trapped not just individuals, but entire family lines in cycles of exploitation. The customer psychology reveals something disturbing about human nature and social conditioning. These weren't inherently evil men, most of them. They were ordinary people who had been socialized to see sexual exploitation as normal and acceptable. They genuinely believed they were engaging in mutually beneficial transactions rather than participating in systematic abuse. This shows how powerful social conditioning can be in overriding individual moral instincts. When an entire society agrees that something is acceptable, individuals within that society rarely question it, even when they're directly participating in obvious harm. The economic incentives built into the Roman system made reform virtually impossible. Too many people were making too much money from sexual exploitation for anyone to have an interest in changing things. Brothel owners, tax collectors, suppliers, landlords, even city officials all benefited financially from the continued operation of the sex trade. When an oppressive system becomes economically essential, moral arguments against it become irrelevant. People will find ways to justify whatever generates profit, especially when that justification is supported by legal frameworks and social norms. The technological limitations of ancient Rome meant that women like Livia had no way to communicate their experiences to the outside world or to organize with other victims. There was no mass media to expose abuses, no communication networks to coordinate resistance, no documentation systems that recorded their perspectives. This informational isolation was another form of control. When victims can't tell their stories, when their experiences aren't recorded or believed, it becomes much easier for oppressive systems to maintain the fiction that everyone involved is satisfied with the arrangement. The urban planning of Roman cities was designed to facilitate the sex trade while maintaining plausible deniability for respectable citizens. Red light districts were located away from main thoroughfares, but connected by networks of alleys and side streets that allowed customers to come and go without being seen by their social peers. This physical separation served multiple purposes. It allowed the trade to flourish without offending public sensibilities. It created distinct geographic zones where different moral rules applied, and it made it easier for customers to psychologically separate their behavior in these districts from their behavior in respectable society. The preservation of Pompeii gives us an unfiltered look at how thoroughly the sex trade was integrated into daily Roman life. The brothels weren't hidden or disguised. They were prominent businesses with explicit advertising and detailed pricing information. The archaeological evidence shows a society that was completely comfortable with the commodification of human sexuality. But that same evidence also shows the human cost. The small rooms, the crude furnishings, the graffiti that reveals both customer satisfaction and female suffering. When we walk through the ruins of these establishments today, we're walking through the preserved remains of systematic human exploitation. The literary evidence from ancient Rome shows how the sex trade influenced art, poetry, and popular culture. Prostitutes appeared in comedies, romances, and historical accounts, usually as stock characters representing either comic relief or moral corruption. But these literary representations tell us more about Roman attitudes than about the actual experiences of real women. The gap between literary fantasy and lived reality was enormous. The glamorous courtesans of Roman fiction bore no resemblance to women like Livia, trapped in cycles of debt and exploitation. But these fictional representations help maintain the social myths that justified the real system. The international scope of the Roman Empire meant that sexual exploitation became a form of cultural imperialism. Roman conquest brought Roman institutions, including the Roman sex trade, to conquered territories. Local women were absorbed into a system that had been perfected in the imperial capital and then exported throughout the known world. This shows how oppressive systems can spread through cultural influence and economic pressure rather than just military force. The Roman model of sexual exploitation became the template for similar systems throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, influencing attitudes and practices that persisted long after the empire itself had fallen. The seasonal and cyclical nature of the Roman economy created predictable patterns of exploitation. Military campaigns generated slaves who fed the sex trade. Economic prosperity increased demand for sexual services. Religious festivals created spikes in business. The entire system operated according to rhythms that had nothing to do with the welfare of the women involved. Understanding these patterns helps us see how systematic the exploitation really was. This wasn't a chaotic or accidental system, it was a carefully organized industry that responded to market forces and maximized profits through the efficient use of human resources. The training and conditioning of women for the sex trade reveals the psychological sophistication of the Roman system. This wasn't just about physical coercion, it involved complex processes of mental conditioning designed to make women complicit in their own exploitation. Women were taught not just sexual techniques, but performance skills, conversation abilities, and emotional manipulation tactics. They were trained to make customers feel desired, powerful, and satisfied while hiding their own pain and degradation. This psychological dimension of the exploitation was perhaps more damaging than the physical abuse. The debt bondage system that trapped women like Livia was mathematically designed to be inescapable. The costs charged for room, board, clothing, and medical care always exceeded the income women could generate through their work. This wasn't accidental miscalculation. It was deliberate economic engineering designed to create permanent servitude. This shows the sophisticated understanding of human psychology and economic incentives that went into designing the system. The Romans understood that financial desperation was more effective than physical force in maintaining control over large populations of exploited people. The healthcare system that served prostitutes was designed to maintain their functionality rather than their well-being. Medical care focused on treating sexually transmitted diseases and managing pregnancies that would interfere with work. There was no concern for the women's overall health or long-term survival. This medical approach treated women like machines that needed maintenance to continue operating rather than human beings deserving of care and dignity. It reveals the complete dehumanization that was necessary to make the system psychologically tolerable for everyone involved. The documentation systems that recorded transactions in the sex trade show the bureaucratic efficiency of Roman exploitation. Detailed records were kept of earnings, expenses, tax obligations, and debt balances. But these records treated women as inventory items rather than human beings. This bureaucratic dehumanization made it easier for everyone involved to ignore the moral implications of what they were doing. When people become numbers on ledgers, their suffering becomes abstract rather than immediate and personal. As we conclude this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, it's crucial to understand that the Roman system of sexual exploitation didn't disappear with the fall of the empire. Its basic elements, debt bondage, legal invisibility, social stigma, economic desperation, and systematic dehumanization, continue to operate in modern human trafficking networks around the world. The technology has changed, the geographic scope has expanded, the legal frameworks have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics remain the same. Vulnerable people, usually women and children, are trapped in systems of exploitation that are designed to be inescapable and are justified by social attitudes that blame victims while protecting perpetrators. Livia's story matters not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. It shows us how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when that evil is normalized by legal systems, economic incentives, and social attitudes. But it also shows us something else. Even in the most oppressive circumstances, even when reduced to the status of property, human beings maintain their essential humanity. Livia's moments of connection with other women, her small acts of resistance, her stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the system, these remind us that the human spirit is more resilient than any system designed to crush it. The Romans believed their civilization was the pinnacle of human achievement. They pointed to their roads, their aqueducts, their laws, their military victories as evidence of their superiority. But the systematic sexual exploitation that was woven into the fabric of their society reveals the moral bankruptcy at the heart of their empire. True civilization isn't measured by architectural achievements or military conquests. It's measured by how a society treats its most vulnerable members. By that standard, Roman civilization was a magnificent failure, a glittering facade covering a foundation of human misery. Today, as we continue to struggle with sexual exploitation, human trafficking, and the commodification of human sexuality, Livia's story serves as both a warning and a challenge. A warning about how easily oppressive systems can become normalized when they serve the interests of the powerful, and a challenge to recognize and resist those systems wherever they exist, because in the end, that's the most important lesson from ancient Rome's brothels. The capacity for systematic exploitation isn't unique to any particular time or place. It's a constant human temptation, always ready to resurface whenever societies lose sight of the fundamental dignity and worth of every individual. Livia's name may be forgotten by history, but her story, the story of human resilience in the face of systematic oppression, deserves to be remembered. Not because it makes us feel good about human nature, but because it reminds us of the vigilance required to prevent such systems from taking root in our own societies. The Roman Empire fell 1600 years ago, but the attitudes, systems, and justifications that made Livia's exploitation possible are still with us. And until we honestly confront that reality, until we truly understand how such systems operate and why people participate in them, we'll continue to repeat the same mistakes that made ancient Rome's sex trade possible. That's why it sucked to be a prostitute in ancient Rome. Not just because of the individual suffering, though that was certainly real and devastating, but because it represented humanity at its worst. Systematic, normalized, profitable exploitation that an entire civilization convinced itself was natural, necessary, and morally acceptable. And that's a lesson we can't afford to forget.